I was a little bored recently. I was kind of in the mood to play some video games, but I wasn't sure exactly what I felt like playing. And for some reason, memories long since buried rose up, and I remembered a series of Flash games that I played as a kid. Dark Cut by JMBT02, or just John. I remember playing these games multiple times each and loving it every time. These games may have been the first surgery simulation type games out there. At least, I couldn't find any earlier ones after spending a bit of time on Google. If you've ever played something like Amateur Surgeon, which you absolutely should by the way, that's basically what Dark Cut is gameplay-wise. So how exactly do these old-ass games, and the first one is closing in on 13 years old, hold up? Before I go any further, I do need to give an epilepsy warning. Dark Cut 2 and 3 use a lot of bright flashing lights, screen shaking, and very jarring pop-ups with a lot of color contrast. It's actually kind of intense. If you're sensitive to that kind of thing, I'd strongly recommend tabbing out and just listening to this video in the background, because there could actually be medical issues there. So with that out of the way, let's look at the first of the Dark Cut series. The first one feels like a proof of concept, but the concept itself is pretty solid. You're a medieval doctor and you're given prompts as to what steps you need to take to treat the patient in front of you. In this game, you have 3 patients to deal with: a soldier with an arrow through his leg, someone with the bubonic plague, and a vampire. There's not all that much to say. The game is pretty straightforward, telling you step by step how to treat each patient, or how to kill the vampire as the case may be. And you do the things like cutting up the arrow or sewing up a wound as the prompts come up. If you screw up, the health icon goes down, and if it gets to 0, you fail and have to start over from the first surgery. Obviously, these aren't real medical procedures, and the game is upfront about telling you not to do this. But for the most part, it actually seems like something you might expect a relatively intelligent medieval person to try, given their lack of actual medical knowledge. Except for the fact that you actually scrub the wounds once you're done. That wasn't really common practice until the advent of germ theory, which was much later on. The only real complaint I'd have is that there were several instances of a little timing minigame where you have to click when an icon is in the right spot, and you'll have to do this 3 times to complete the section. For whatever reason, the timing just feels off every so often, and I've definitely failed sections because of it. And my muscle memory is actually above average, so I don't think it's just me, though I can't really prove it. There was also some lag, particularly when there were a lot of icons on screen, but I don't remember this ever being an issue when I was younger, so I'm willing to chalk it up to being an old game not playing nice with either my browser or the latest version of Flash. But aside from that, it was a fun, if short, very short, experience, and I remember back in the day it was a cool surprise that the final surgery was to kill a vampire. All in all, considering that this was made by one guy in 2007, good shit. Then came Dark Cut 2, and one final warning. For the rest of the video, flashing and screen shaking will be a thing. Click away if that's something that can fuck you up. Here you play as a Union doctor in the US Civil War. Same overall premise, though here you're treating a variety of war wounds, so bullets and shrapnel. Almost immediately, you'll notice some significant changes. Visually, it no longer looks like, well, a simplistic Flash project. It has a grittier and somewhat more realistic aesthetic. It's pretty neat, and I think it plays well into the whole horrors of war feel the game was going for. It does result in a lot of visual noise on screen where there's really so much crap going on that it can be hard to see what you actually need to see, and it can also be distracting aside from that. I think it comes down to John's inexperience there. I've played some of his other games, and they're generally cartoony and have this arcade kind of feel to them. This more serious, intense style of game was out of his element, and I don't think he realized that this could be a problem. The mechanics were also a bit more complex. To start, there's a tool selection bar at the bottom of the screen. There's also a drunkenness meter, because one of the things you need to do, and this is actually historically accurate, is get your patients hammered because proper anesthesia isn't really a thing. Basically, the less drunk the patient is, the faster their health goes down, so you've got to get them drunk and keep them drunk. Though I will say, they sober up really fast. I mean, 5 shots in, and 90 seconds later they've burned off half of it. Otherwise, the gameplay is mostly the same, though one annoying thing is that a lot of the tools are really big and there's some awkwardness in using them. In particular, it's tough to see where exactly the click box is for the rag tool. Not game-breaking or anything, but annoying nonetheless. And now, I've got to talk about the flashing lights. To emphasize the chaos that's surrounding you and to highlight instances of the patient feeling pain, bright flashes and shapes go across your screen, and it actually does achieve its goals. I felt much more immersed in this game than the last, largely due to the intensity factor, but it can definitely go too far, and surprisingly, the game itself did not have an epilepsy warning, or at least not one that I noticed. Now, I'm fine with flashing lights, but even for me, it did seem somewhat excessive at times. I think John could have gotten the same effect with fewer downsides, but again, I'll chalk it up to inexperience. Now, the game does something really cool towards the end. You're interrupted during the second to last surgery by artillery fire. Your screen goes black and you see a message. Do you want to live? When you click yes, you get, then prove it. and you're immediately thrown into the final surgery where you have to amputate your own leg. Here, your health is already low, so you've got to keep yourself absolutely smashed as you deal with the craziest screen effects so far. Pretty soon after, a will to live icon shows up on screen, and you have to actually mash the spacebar to keep it up because if it depletes, you die. Overall, this surgery isn't all that difficult, but the combination of its dramatic introduction and the craziness you have to deal with dials the intensity factor up to 11. Now, unfortunately for me, it's bugged. I couldn't complete it. For whatever reason, the saw tool has this tendency to glitch out and just flicker on the bottom of the screen, meaning I can't actually use it to saw off my leg. Nothing I did could fix it. I beat this game as a kid, so I know it wasn't always like this, but unfortunately I couldn't actually get the game finished. And let's be real here, I highly doubt John is gonna fix it considering his last game release was 8 years ago. So sadly, this game is probably doomed to be unbeatable. Dark Cut 2 holds a really interesting place in my mind. On the one hand, it's more refined and has a lot more going for it than the first game, but at the same time it's still kind of a jumbled mess. Plus there's the aforementioned saw bug, but I'm not gonna hold that against John because it's really not his fault. To me, this game feels like it's the awkward puberty stage of the series. It's going through positive change, but it's still got work to do, though it's already lost the simplistic charm of its predecessor. Honestly, of the three, this is the game I'm least likely to replay in the future, Sawbug aside. Okay, on to the third and final Dark Cut game, appropriately named Dark Cut 3. Here you play as a doctor in what I can only assume is the future, as there's some cool sci-fi shit going on. The premise of this one is that you basically connect yourself to the internet where your sentient computer will transport you back in time so you can perform surgery on your ancestors who died of various war injuries. I know it sounds a little convoluted, but it actually feels pretty natural in the context of the game. Visually, there's still a bit of that flashing and screen shake, but it's nowhere near as bad as the second game. It still has that gritty art style, though I'd say it's a bit crisper. Overall, it has the same feel as 2, but just a bit better. It's also notable for being the only game of the three that displays in a widescreen resolution, though it's not at a 16:9 aspect ratio for some reason. Gameplay-wise, they actually stripped down and streamlined a lot of what 2 introduced. Drunkenness is replaced by sedation, where you drug the patient up with a needle. It's a simpler process and you don't actually have to maintain it like you do in 2 if you're fast enough, which is nice. The one issue here is that the game doesn't really explain that you have to sedate the patients, and the icon is kinda hidden in the corner, so I remember as a kid not even knowing that it was an option until the levels became literally impossible without using it. It's also kind of funny because the zone you need to click on is just a specific section of your screen rather than varying from patient to patient. So in one mission, you literally jam a needle into the concrete floor rather than the patient. The tool selection bar is completely gone, and instead you automatically equip whatever tools you need, like the first game. One thing that's really nice is that John added actual indicators for where your click zone is in the form of these little crosshairs. This is a huge quality of life upgrade from the second, and it goes a long way to making 3 feel more clean and professional. The surgeries play out mostly in the same way as the previous 2, though I'd say that these surgeries are on average easier than those in the other 2 games. One thing I have to mention is how lore plays a much bigger part of this game than the others. In 1 and 2, you just get a short note detailing your orders and explaining what's up with your patient. You'll still get a brief description of the issue in 3, but you'll also get a nice little post-game summary of how that person's life turned out after escaping what was initially their death. After each stage, the computer will offer a bit of commentary, something along the lines of how it's happy that it gets to assist you in saving people. And there was one stage that really blew me away story-wise. The patient was a man who died alone in an abandoned shed, waiting in the vain hope that someone would find him. From before his injury right up to his death, he wrote letters to his family, each one getting less and less hopeful. As you're operating on him, the letters pop up on screen. Combined with the generally depressing nature of the setting and the music, you almost see this tragic scene play out in front of you, and it was really solid storytelling. I liked it, though it kinda pissed me off that it was the only stage that tried something like that. It was so good, but it was an outlier, which is a real shame. And then of course, just like the other 2, Dark Cut 3 has its own twist mission as a finale. Here, you try to log out, probably because you just need a break, but the computer's just like, nah fam, you're staying here, and refuses to let you pull the uplink out of your arm. Eventually it starts hurting you, which you have to quickly fix, and it'll also start disrupting your senses, so the screen will move around, there'll be shit popping up around you, and you'll even see a blue screen of death at one point. And much like the last game, you've got to yeet a limb. This time it's your hand. I have no idea why this psycho of a doctor keeps a hacksaw within arm's reach of his computer desk, but I guess it's good that he does because otherwise he'd have never gotten free. This whole scene was pretty neat, but the foreshadowing was about as subtle as a brick. Of course, there's the fact that in writing, sentient AIs almost always end up turning bad, so it's hard to mislead an audience in that way. But also, you can see the AI becoming more and more obsessive about its quest to save people. Realistically, the only logical conclusion would be that it would go insane and demand your total dedication. Plus, the mission list showed several surgeries and then log out as your to-do list, so it was kinda obvious that logging out wasn't gonna go so smoothly. But still, it was actually pretty ambitious from a writing perspective. Not that the story itself was particularly out there, but John was not known for serious writing. If his games had any story at all, it was simplistic and usually silly, so I do respect his willingness to branch out a bit, and I think he did a decent job considering he was outside his comfort zone. Overall, Dark Cut 3 is clearly the best of the series from a technical perspective, a gameplay perspective, and a writing perspective. I'd also argue that it has the best mechanics, though that's a little bit less cut and dry. I also prefer the visuals of 3. As much as I do criticize 2 and 3 for the bright flashing lights, I do appreciate the emotion it brings out, and since I'm not photosensitive, the downsides were relatively minor for me. Of course, Dark Cut 1 does have that classic Flash aesthetic, so there's a nostalgia factor there that its sequels lack, but that's ultimately going to come down to personal preference. Overall, the Dark Cut series was an interesting look back at gaming history and my childhood, though I was kinda surprised at how short the games were. I beat each of them in under 10 minutes. Well, except for 2, but that was only due to a game-breaking bug. Browser-based Flash games were actually a pretty big deal at the time, and John definitely held some renown amongst players. Dark Cut, for what it was a pretty solid concept, and while I think the execution could have been a bit better, it was still pretty good. And I'm fairly certain that the mechanics likely inspired the Amateur Surgeon series, which has a very similar concept but refined the idea much more than John ever did. It also took a more comedic angle to the whole thing, which I think makes a lot more sense when you're looking at these obviously bad medical practices. Regardless, I'm glad to have gone back and played the Dark Cut games, and if you have some time to spare, I definitely recommend checking them out. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe if you want to see more. I upload every Monday, so make sure to check back in next week. Follow me on Twitter at AdsTweets for updates and memes, and follow me on Twitch at AdsGames where I like to stream my editing sessions for these videos. Once again, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next Monday.
Hit the road, Jack, and don't you come back no more, no more, no more, no more.